Hey guys, so today I have another rare book recommendation for you. And this is an author I've known about for a while, but I had only seen one of his books that I think is probably his most common. But today I'm going to recommend one that has count them, one good read review. And it's 10 years old. So this particular book is one of his lesser known books. As far as I know, it was only printed once in the 60s. And that author's name is R.G. Vliet. I guess he used to go by Russ, because that's how most of his friends talk about him. Russ Vliet. And so just a short background, born in 1929, he lived in Texas. And most of his work deals with Texas, even though, like many writers, he lived in Texas for his childhood and youth, and then, some of his early adulthood, and then left and never really came back to Texas, apart from like a 6-month stint at a kind of like a, what am I trying to say? Not a scholarship program, but like where a scholar goes to a different place and, studies for 6 months or whatever. One of those things, a grant or foundation thing. And we were having a funny conversation about Bolaño the other day about how, someone said he was a Mexican writer, even though he lived majority of his life in Chile and Spain. But because, one or two of his books takes place in Mexico, he's a Mexican writer. Joyce is a French writer. R.G. Vliet is a northerner. No, but really he is very much a Texas writer, I would say. And that's been one of my general projects lately, to find good authors, high quality authors that are neglected because they're not from California or the Northeast. And as I'm sure you guys know, just from paying attention in general, most of the authors you'll see from America, from pretty much any time period, but especially the 20th century, they all come from San Francisco, Los Angeles, or 100 miles from New York, 100-mile radius of New York. So, which is pretty disappointing. You have some standouts, Faulkner, and maybe Hemingway counts because he's from the Midwest, but so that's been one of my background interests, and R.G. Vliet fits into that category. The book that I was mentioning that's relatively common to find, I think, is because it was reprinted, is called, let me get it here, Soledad. Now, this was originally printed in 1977 under the title Solitudes, but it apparently was edited quite heavily before publication by the editor. And this was reprinted after he died. He died in the 80s, relatively young. And this was reprinted after he died by his wife as a, basically a restored edition, where it added back some chapters that were cut, of course changed the title and so on. But it's a novel about the 1880s in Mexico, a Western. And I'll just read you the little flap here. Central and Southwest Texas, the hill country in Edwards Plateau in 1881. A cowboy known as Claiborne or Clabe kills a Mexican stranger for reasons he himself does not fully comprehend. He removes from the stranger's body a smudged photograph of a young woman in a white dress. His first glimpse of the photograph is the beginning of his wanderings in an obsessive search for the woman. So begins this remarkable novel. On one level, a new variation on the age-old Western story of the wandering, lonesome cowboy. But as the story unfolds, several other levels become visible. Racial and family tensions, the burden of guilt and the need for absolution, the tangled interplay of love, sex, and violence, and the peculiar ache of solitude that pervades the lives and landscape of this book. The plot that began as a simple search takes turn and makes connections that repeatedly surprise the reader. And another interesting book that he wrote which I haven't read and I don't have possession of. It's called Scorpio Rising, which is another Western, but interestingly enough, it was published in 1985 by Random House. You might know what else was published in 1985 by Random House that was a Western, Blood Meridian by Cormac McCarthy. And another McCarthy connection between R.G. Vliet and McCarthy is that McCarthy's archives is located in San Marcos at the Whitliff Collections. R.G. Vliet's archives are located in San Marcos and the Whitliff Collections. So there are some obvious similarities. R.G. Vliet did go to school there at, it used to be called, I think, Southwestern State, Texas State College. Now it's called Southwestern. But yeah, just kind of interesting connections. Whenever I went to the Whitliff Collections, I didn't look at the R.G. Vliet materials, but maybe when I go back, I'll have to do that. But anyway, so this is just background. The book I'm going to be focusing on today is his first book he published, and it's a book of poems. He thought of himself chiefly as a poet, as far as I can tell. He did write one novel early on called Rock Spring, which was his first novel, and then second came Solitudes, and then Scorpio Rising. Those were his three novels. But he also did publish several books of poetry, the first one of which is the one I'm going to be talking about today, called Events and Celebrations. And this one I found in the probably my favorite bookstore and the second best bookstore I've been to. It is Recycled Books and Records in Denton, Texas. And yeah, this book was published in 1966 by Viking. My second favorite bookstore, but the best bookstore I've been to, is Moe's Books in San Francisco. Just came back from Los Angeles and was completely disappointed by Los Angeles bookstore selection, but maybe I just caught it on a bad day. But anyway, this collection of poetry, Events and Celebrations, 1966. I would say, when I was thinking about, how to describe it, and, I always hate, this type of thing, but you do get feelings of Frank Stanford, I think. And the two main connections I would make between R.G. Vliet and Frank Stanford is the usage of like accented language in the sense of marked language, like a dialect. And then you have the really kind of interesting rundown narratives, that you also get in Cormac McCarthy. Although in McCarthy, they have a completely different feeling. They feel almost, mythical. I feel like in Frank Stanford, it's kind of more like a maybe documentary type poetry. Although I can't say that, Frank Stanford's not, doesn't reach to the mythical in that way, but I would be hesitant to say R.G. Vliet is similar to McCarthy's writing style, but I wouldn't be hesitant to say it's similar to Frank Stanford. So that's just to give you a taste of if you're familiar with Frank Stanford, I would definitely pick this up. Also, if you're just interested in Texas writing, if you like Westerns, if you like dialect, writing in dialect, I'm going to read two poems from this book. I won't be reading one long narrative poem called Clem Maverick, which is a narrative poem about a country singer. And it's kind of the typical story. This guy from the middle of nowhere ends up getting a guitar, a Mexican guitar, and learns the guitar from a African-American, just poor, low down, three-fingered guitar player, learns it from, and then, becomes super famous and dies super young, the typical story. Starts out a hillbilly and ends up a country singer. And it's told in a narrative style that's pretty interesting because it's told from the periphery of his life. And I've always enjoyed that. I've always enjoyed stories where there's a central character, like the main character, that you never meet or you never actually see their actions. It's always their actions through the lens or the glimpse of a surrounding character in the periphery of their life. I think that's a really interesting, compelling way to tell a story. But so that's available. That was also published in its own, but it is available in this Events and Celebrations edition. So I'm just going to jump right into it. I've already talked for 10 minutes. Don't want this to be too long, but the first poem I'm going to read is relatively close to the beginning of the work, and his poems don't really have titles. Generally, the title is the first line in the poem, and so I'm just going to read it, assuming it doesn't have a title. And yeah, let's jump right into it. This will give you a feel for what he's like. Now for the 20th straight time today, we've argued this same petty way. First it was trout, you claimed they rise for pleasure, I say for flies. And thimbleberry, you called it wild grape, as if grape ever flowed with such a 5 and salmon-petaled show. And next blackberry, christening it field rose or some such. I swear you don't know a damn thing hardly that grows. Possums are porcupines, garters, rattlers in your eyes. And this moment, making camp, what cries darkness is about us are bears in droves instead of mere crust-hunting red squirrel spies. I swear you don't know. Oh Christ, you win. Naming now love to me, you win, it's better so. And one thing I love is the really close eye for specific species of plants, which of course you get with McCarthy. But this next one comes from the latter half of the book, which this book was published when the author was almost 40 years old, 37 years old, I believe. And so this is a collection from a large span of his life, at least 10 years worth of poems. So this second poem I'm going to read comes from part 3. There are 4 parts. All of part 4 is prose poetry, which I'm not going to read from. But so yeah, this one is the second and last poem I'm going to read. Give you an idea. Maybe this is his later period in this book. The crickets in their antique real world, shrill Ethiops of the grass blade cry, and dust-drenched beetles clicking and rasp of fans where tobacco-rich grasshoppers fly. Though caterpillars climb by furry hunches in silence to the ravel day, and dry cornstalks scrape and crows scaring upward like scattershot peppering the sky, and grackles and grackles and grackles in bunches, breaking southward from their sparse branch berths with a rinsing noise, the year's full hull receding through high noontide surf. And then, wasn't planning to, but I'll read the first poem in the book, which is kind of like an Ars Poetica. All right. Poetry, if it must come never kept, but unkempt and dragging weed up from the seas, must be bulbous-eyed from old astonishments, a crank species meant not actually to be seen. Yet sweaty fishermen hauling continually from need sometimes fetch it up. It flops, thumping the deck's croaks. The fishermen think they hear it speak. More certainly it squeaks, being slung in insubstantial air, and with all a dizzy ache behind its gills. Its claws, which must dip antique moss, gesticulate. It knows a city that is only deep below. So, he likes the word antique. But yeah, I like that. Slung in insubstantial air. But yeah, I mean, it's always surprising to run across authors like this, because I would say that, this guy's poetry is more lively than the vast majority of contemporary poetry published today, in my opinion. And not to say that contemporary poetry is popular or anything, but a lot of bad poetry has more than one review on Goodreads. So, yeah, I guess it's just always so shocking. Yeah. These books you can find for pretty cheap, but there don't seem to be many around, so highly recommend it. And I do plan on making a few more videos of rare Texas writers, so if you're interested in that, stay tuned. All right, well, I think this has gone on for long enough. Thanks for everyone for supporting my Patreon. I'm exceptionally grateful, and I'll try to be better about keeping the recommendations coming a little quicker. So anyway, thanks. That is a gang boss.